A city so rich that merchants complained gold was cheaper than water. A city so lawless the preachers packed up and sailed home. And a city so completely gone that today you can float in a boat directly above its rooftops and never know it. On a Tuesday morning in June of 1692, 2/3 of Port Royal, Jamaica slid off the edge of the harbor and disappeared into the sea in under 2 minutes. The streets are still down there. The taverns are still down there. So are the people. These are 10 things about the sunken city off the coast of Jamaica that almost nobody talks about. Before we go under, do one thing. Hit subscribe. This channel digs into the Caribbean stories that got buried, ignored, or quietly written out of the history books. And this one is the biggest of them all. Number 1. The 2 minutes that swallowed a city. June the 7th, 1692. Late morning. Port Royal was going about its business, which mostly meant unloading cargo, counting money, and drinking. Then the ground moved. Not the way ground normally moves in an earthquake. Witnesses described the streets rolling like waves on the ocean, opening up, closing again, and opening somewhere else. Buildings did not fall over so much as sink straight down, floor by floor, as if the earth were quietly eating them. Within roughly 2 minutes, around 33 acres of the town were underwater. 2,000 people died that morning, crushed, drowned, or simply gone. Another 3,000 died in the weeks after from injuries and disease in a town that no longer had clean water, food, or anywhere to bury anybody. Survivors wrote letters describing bodies floating in the harbor, alongside coffins that had been shaken out of the graveyard. And this was not some tiny colonial outpost. Port Royal was, at that moment, arguably the most important English city in the entire Western Hemisphere. It went from that to a debris field in less time than it takes to boil an egg. And the strangest thing about all of this is what the ocean did next. Because the very disaster that destroyed that town is the exact same thing that preserved it. Number 2. They called it the wickedest city on earth. To understand why the sinking of Port Royal hit Europe like a thunderclap, you have to understand what Port Royal was. Around 6,500 people were packed onto a narrow spit of sand at the mouth of Kingston Harbour, living in roughly 2,000 buildings, some of them 4 stories tall, made of brick, on ground that was basically a sandbar. The wealth came from privateering. English privateers, which is a polite word for pirates with paperwork, used Port Royal as a base to raid Spanish ships in Spanish ports, and they brought the plunder home to spend it. Contemporary accounts describe an absurd density of taverns, brothels, and gambling houses. Preachers who arrived to save souls tended to give up and leave, and at least one reportedly went home with his church bell. Because nobody was coming, clergymen across the Atlantic called it Sodom of the New World, the wickedest city on earth. So when it vanished into the sea on a clear morning, the sermons practically wrote themselves. But that nickname does a lot of convenient work, and it hides the real business of the town. Port Royal was not just a party. It was a deep water port and a trading hub, and a significant amount of the money running through it came from trafficking enslaved Africans, who were held, sold, and shipped from that harbor like cargo. The rum and the roulette wheels are the part that ended up in the movies. The auction blocks are the part that did not. When you hear that Port Royal was the wealthiest English settlement in the Americas, that is what the wealth was built on, and it matters. Because the people crushed under the sand that morning included the enslaved as well as the enslavers. Number 3. The ground turned into liquid. Port Royal was built on sand. Loose, water-saturated sand, sitting on a 16-mile spit that had been slowly deposited by the sea over thousands of years. And when a strong enough earthquake shakes wet sand, something happens that sounds like something out of a nightmare. The grains lose contact with each other, the water pushes them apart, and the ground stops behaving like solid earth and starts behaving like a thick liquid. Geologists call it liquefaction. That is why the survivors describe the streets moving like water. That is why brick buildings sank vertically instead of toppling. That is why people were reportedly swallowed up to their necks and then trapped when the sand settled and clamped around them like concrete. And here is the part that ought to bother you. The exact same thing happened again in Kingston in 1907, and the proof is still standing at Port Royal today. It is a small stone artillery store known as the Giddy House. The 1907 quake liquefied the ground under one side of it and the whole building tilted. Walk inside, and the floor slopes so hard that your inner ear tells you that you are falling. Visitors stumble around laughing. It is also a warning sign about what the ground under this entire spit is willing to do. Number 4. A warship sailed over the rooftops. When the seabed dropped, the water had to go somewhere, and what came back at Port Royal was a wall of it. Sitting in the harbor that morning was a Royal Navy frigate called the Swan, hauled over on her side for repairs, which meant she was floating helplessly, with no rigging and no way to steer. The wave picked her up, carried her clean over the drowned buildings of the town, and dropped her inland on top of the wreckage. Instead of being a disaster, she became a lifeboat. Survivors thrashing in the water grabbed the hull and climbed aboard, and the Swan is credited with saving lives that morning simply by being in the wrong place at the right time. Picture that for a second. You are standing on a street. The street becomes the sea, and then a warship comes over your head. Nobody in Port Royal had ever seen anything like it, and nobody who lived through it ever shut up about it, which is a large part of why we know the story at all. Number 5. One man was swallowed by the earth and spat back out. His name was Louis Galdi, a French-born merchant who had come to Jamaica to make a life. When the earthquake hit, the ground under him split open, and he fell in. That should have been the end of the story, and for a lot of people that morning it was. But a second shock hit while he was down there. The fissure convulsed, and it threw him back out, flinging him into the sea. He swam. He was picked up by a boat. He survived, and then he lived another 47 years in Jamaica, becoming a respected member of the community and a church warden until he died in 1739. You can go and read the whole thing yourself, because it is carved into his tombstone at St. Peter's Church in Port Royal, which still stands, and which still tells anybody who walks up to it that this man was swallowed up in the great earthquake, and by the providence of God was by another shock thrown into the sea. It is possibly the greatest flex ever chiseled into stone, but he is the exception. For every Louis Galdi, there were hundreds who went into the sand and stayed there. Number 6. A pocket watch down there stopped at the exact moment. In 1959, an American named Edwin Link, the engineer who invented the flight simulator, brought a research vessel to Kingston Harbour and went looking for the sunken city. Working with the Institute of Jamaica, his team dredged and dived and hauled up bottles, pipes, pewter plates, and pieces of a town that had not seen daylight in nearly 3 centuries. And then they brought up a corroded brass pocket watch, so encrusted that the face was unreadable. So they X-rayed it. The image showed the hands, frozen where they had stopped when the seawater killed the mechanism. 11:43 in the morning. That is the timestamp of the apocalypse. That single object did something no document could. It took a paragraph in a history book and turned it into a specific minute on a specific Tuesday, when a specific man in a specific street stopped having a future. Historians had argued about the timing for centuries. A watch settled it, and it had been sitting on the seabed the entire time, waiting for somebody to ask. Number 7. Henry Morgan's grave is somewhere out there. Sir Henry Morgan is the most famous pirate the Caribbean ever produced, the man who sacked Panama, got knighted for it, and ended up as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, which tells you everything about how the empire really worked. He drank himself to death in 1688 and was buried with a gun salute in the Palisados Cemetery at Port Royal. 4 years later, the earthquake took the cemetery. The whole burial ground, headstones, coffins, and all, went into Kingston Harbour, along with the rest of the town, and it has never been found. So the most notorious privateer in Caribbean history has no grave you can visit. He's out there under the silt somewhere, in a coffin nobody has located, in a graveyard that became part of the seabed. Every so often, somebody launches an expedition to find him. Nobody has. And honestly, for a man who spent his career taking things that did not belong to him and disappearing, that ending has a certain symmetry to it. It also tells you how total the destruction was. This was not a corner of town. The earthquake took the port, the market, the warehouses, the wharves, and the dead. Whole streets that appear on 17th century maps of Port Royal now sit in open water with fishing boats passing over them. If you had the map and a boat and a rough idea of where you were, you could sail down what used to be a road. Number 8. It is the Pompeii of the Caribbean, and that is not marketing. Here is what makes Port Royal genuinely unique in the world, and why archaeologists get emotional about it. Most shipwrecks and ruins get smashed, scattered, and rotted. Port Royal did the opposite. The buildings sank fast, upright, and were sealed under sand and silt almost immediately, which cut off the oxygen. No oxygen means no rot and no shipworms. So things survived that never survive. Between 1981 and 1990, a team from Texas A&M University, led by the archaeologist Donnie Hamilton, excavated a section of the submerged town under about 20 feet of water and found intact building walls, wooden floors, and entire rooms with the contents still lying where they fell. Leather shoes, wooden barrels, onions and cooking pots, a tavern with a drinking vessel still in place. In one building, they recovered a full set of pewter plates and a brass tap, and the remains of the meal somebody had been preparing when the earth moved. This is not a ruin. It is a moment, frozen, with the table still set. There is genuinely nothing else like it in the Americas, and they have barely scratched it. 10 years of underwater excavation covered a handful of buildings on a couple of streets. The rest of the sunken town, the wharves, the warehouses, the homes, the bodies, is still sealed under the sand where it fell, waiting on funding, technology, and somebody who cares enough to look. Every diver who has worked that site says the same thing. You swim over what feels like a featureless muddy bottom. You fan the silt away with your hand, and a brick wall appears, standing exactly where a builder laid it in the 1600s. Number 9. The treasure hunters got there first. Before archaeology arrived, the scavengers did. Salvage started within days of the earthquake, with boats rowing over the drowned houses and men diving down to grab whatever they could reach while bodies were still in the water. That never really stopped. In the 1960s, a treasure hunter named Robert Marks worked the site under a government contract and pulled up an enormous quantity of material. And while a lot of it ended up in Jamaican collections, the methods of the era destroyed context that can never be recovered. Divers used suction dredges. Objects came up without any record of what room they were in or what they were sitting next to, and plenty of other people simply helped themselves over the years, because the site sits in a shallow harbor next to a working town, and you cannot exactly put a fence around the sea. So a huge part of the sunken city's story is already gone, not because the earthquake took it, but because people with hoses and boats took it afterwards. That is the quiet tragedy underneath the fun pirate stuff, and it is worth saying plainly what got lost. An archaeologist does not care about a silver coin because it is silver. They care about which house it was in, which drawer, next to whose shoe, on which street. That is the information. Rip the coin out of the sand and sell it, and you have turned a piece of evidence into a souvenir, permanently. Port Royal had that done to it for close to 300 years, before anybody thought to stop it. Which means the version of the sunken city we can still study is the version the looters could not be bothered to reach. The paperwork is gone, the context is gone, and no amount of money can ever buy that back now. Number 10. The world finally made it official, and you still have not heard of it. Port Royal today is a quiet fishing village of a couple of thousand people at the end of a long road out of Kingston. There are fish shacks. There is Fort Charles, the one fort that survived, where a teenage Horatio Nelson once stood watch. There is the tilted Giddy House, and offshore, under 15 to 40 feet of green water, there is one of the most significant archaeological sites on the planet, mostly unexcavated, protected by law and by silt. On the 12th of July, 2025, UNESCO finally inscribed the archaeological ensemble of 17th century Port Royal on the World Heritage List, making it only Jamaica's second World Heritage Site. Jamaicans had been pushing for that recognition for decades, while the rest of the world obsessed over lost cities that may never have existed at all. And that is the thing that should annoy you. People will argue about Atlantis for hours. Meanwhile, there is a real sunken city, with a real date, a real death toll, and a real pocket watch stopped at 11:43, sitting in shallow water off the coast of Jamaica, and it does not even come up in conversation. There is also a fight going on over what happens next. Jamaica built a cruise ship pier at Port Royal, and heritage bodies have pushed back hard on the idea of parking floating cities on top of a site this fragile, because propellers, dredging, and wake do not mix well with 300-year-old brick walls resting under 20 feet of water. Everybody wants the visitors and the money. Almost nobody wants to be the generation that finally finished off what the earthquake started. The village needs the income. The archaeologists need the site left alone. And those two things are pulling in opposite directions right now, which is exactly the kind of argument that decides whether a place like this survives another century. So the next time somebody tells you about a mysterious lost city under the waves, tell them about Port Royal. Not a myth, not a theory, a real town with real streets, real taverns, and real people that dropped into the Caribbean in about 2 minutes on a Tuesday morning and has been sitting there ever since with its table still set. And if you ever find yourself in Kingston, take the drive out along the Palisados, past the airport, all the way to the end. Stand at the edge of the water at Port Royal and look out. It is calm. It is green. It is completely unremarkable. Under it is a city. If this is your kind of story, the video on screen right now goes into another piece of Caribbean history that got buried. Go click it.